honor. It's funny, you'll notice the picture in the newsletter is a picture of me and my daughter. Most of the time I'm doing 18th century reenacting. And that picture is actually from an event we did at Fort Ticonderoga for their 250th anniversary in 2008. And it's always interesting at the end of an event when you tear down your tent and everybody burns their shorts and t-shirts and we look at each other like, who are you? I don't recognize you anymore. And we always joke that the men always look much more handsome in old-fashioned clothes because when they put the old-fashioned clothes on, they put on the old-fashioned manners that go along with it. So, not that any of you are not full of old-fashioned manners. You guys are very lovely. And thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. As you mentioned, I teach a class called Living History. We're so excited to be leading a station tomorrow. The kids are going to be totally immersed in character the whole day. They all have little backstories, so if you want to quiz them or knock them off their game and try to get them to break character, go for it. I told them to be ready for anything. So I'm very excited about that. Some of the kids are actually that are really very adept at leading the dancing are actually coming in their gowns and stuff. So I'm excited to have that dynamic. And then most of them are soldiers, of course. So, but the topic for tonight is women in the Civil War. This is a topic that's been interesting to me since I was in middle school and first saw the movie Gone with the Wind. And was swept off my feet by the wind and the myths and wanted to be Scarlet O'Hara for Halloween and answered the phone for an entire month. Hi, y'all. Because I had to have the accent to go with it. And so I call this talk Myths of the Late Unpleasantness. And I start with this lovely picture of the President of the Confederacy. Myths about women in the Civil War era began with the war itself, really. This is a picture of Jefferson Davis in his wife's dress and bonnet. It was the original dark-humored Facebook meme, the original Photoshop job. He never actually looked like that. It's totally fake. From all the actual accounts, Jefferson was only wearing his wife's overcoat to evade capture at the end of the war when the Union officials were chasing him. But rumors spread he was in full drag by the time he was caught by soldiers from Michigan and Wisconsin. I believe it was the first Wisconsin, in Irwin County, Georgia. In fact, there was even a famous song written about it, Jeff in Petticoats. Why is this such a big deal? Well, no man in his right mind, especially one in any place in power who wanted to keep sane, would willingly trade places with a woman in the 19th century. Jefferson Davis himself described the role of women and women's part in the social economy, he said, as she has been made beautiful and gentle, so should be to soothe. Her true altar is the happy fireside. Wasn't that lovely? I often think, what would he make of me? Carol Birkin, who is the author of this marvelous book, if you haven't read it, Civil War Wives, gotta check it out. It's marvelously funny, very easy to read. And it's in part about Jefferson Davis's wife, Verena Howell Davis. She went on to describe women in this book. She says, if woman's role was more idealized and her sphere more restricted in the South, it is still recognizable as Jefferson's generalization to Americans of any region. From the dizzying heights of their imaginary pedestals, mistresses sewed for their family and their slaves, planted and weeded their gardens, tended their orchards, nursed their children, supervised their staff, prepared to serve as gracious hostesses to a steady stream of guests and relatives who broke the rhythm of their days. Poorer women and black women were denied the place on the pedestal, suffered limitations placed on them by gender ideology without even the pretext of reverence for their femininity. Rather like the Irish women who worked in the northern factories or as domestic servants, these women were invisible within the cult of domesticity that came with women in this era. Women north and south were expected to be both above and beneath certain things. Politics, social reform movements, although icky than others for them to be involved in, less shocking. Professional entertaining, one must not be an actress or singer unless one wants one's reputation completely ruined. Business is generally right out. In fact, when women in desperate situations during the war were forced to take action over mismanagement, the press they received was most unflattering. These pictures are from the bread riots in 1863 in Richmond, and they're telling. The contrast between the pictures on the left and the pictures on the right are pretty incredible. We've got the steadfast beauties kissing their sweethearts and waving their handkerchiefs off to fight for the cause. And on the other picture, we've got women who are showing ankles and destroying public property and going out improperly covered. And I'm joking with my students, they generally look like they're auditioning for roles on the series The Walking Dead as the zombies. Awful, hideous women. And that was on purpose. So who women really were was already expertly covered by Jennifer's lines. So where do characters that we so revere from the Civil War now, where did they come from? The first wave, if you will, of enduring Civil War women characters actually comes from a contemporary of the Civil War, Louisa May Alcott, who's the author of Little Women. Like her character, Jo March, young Louisa was a tomboy. She writes, "No boy could be my friend until I had beaten him in a race." And she claimed if no girl could be my friend if she refused to climb trees and leap fences. For Louisa, writing was a very early passion, of course. She had a rich imagination, and often her stories became melodramas that she and her sisters would act out for friends. And I just got done telling you that being an actress wasn't necessarily the most accepted role for proper young ladies. But she was very into it, and she always wanted to play the villains, the ghosts, the bandits, and the disdainful queens. At 15, troubled by the poverty that plagued her family, she vowed that she will do something by and by. "I don't care what," she wrote, "teach, sew, act, write, anything to help the family. And I'll be rich and famous and happy before I die. See if I won't." She sounds like Jo March. Confronting a society that offered little opportunity to women seeking employment, Louisa was determined. She said, "I will make a battering ram of my head and make my way through this rough and tumble world." I love that image, making a battering ram of your head. It makes me think that maybe the helmet she's got going on with her hair might be useful in that. Battering ram. That's hard to do, by the way. Louisa's career as an author began with her poetry and short stories that appeared in popular magazines. And in 1854, when she was 22, her first book was published. It was called Flower Fables. But the real milestone in her literary path was a book called Hospital Sketches that are based on letters that she had written home from her post as a nurse in Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to read you a couple of excerpts from these because they're just very, very charming. She writes, "As boys going to sea immediately become nautical in speech, walk as if they already had their sea legs on, and shiver their timbers in all possible occasions, so I turned military at once when I found out I was to be a nurse, called my dinner my rations, saluted all newcomers, ordered a dress parade that very afternoon. Having reviewed every rag I possessed, I detailed some for picket duty while airing over the fence, some to the sanitary influences of the washtub, others to mount guard in the trunk, while the weak and wounded went to the workbasket hospital to be made ready for active service again. It is now 1, she said, I shall march at 6. I packed my go-abroady possessions, tumbled the rest into 2 big boxes, danced on the lids till they shut, and gave them in charge in one direction. If I never come back, make a bonfire of it all. She choked down a cup of tea and was about to leave, hugged my family 3 times all around without a vestige of unmanly emotion, till a certain dear old lady broke upon my neck with a despairing sort of wail. "Oh, my dear, how can I let you go?" she said. "I'll stay if you say so, Mother." "But don't go," she answered. "The Lord will take care of you." Much of this Roman matron's courage had gone into the Yankee matron's composition condition, and in spite of her tears, she would have sent 10 sons to the war had she possessed them, as freely as she sent one daughter, smiling and flapping on the doorstep till I vanished. Through the eyes that followed me were dim, and the handkerchief she waved was very wet. So we look at the fiction versus the reality. Those are all based on her real experiences, as cute as and charming as she writes them. These are actually pictures from my school's production of Little Women that Connie, thank you. Connie helped us make the costumes for. And when Louisa was 35 years old, her publisher in Boston, Thomas Miles, asked her to write a book for girls. Little Women was written at Orchard House from May to July of 1868. And the novel is based on her and her sister's coming of age, but it's set in Civil War New England. Jo March was the first American juvenile heroine to act from her own individuality, a living, breathing person rather than an idealized stereotype that was pretty prevalent in children's fiction at this time. And Jo March might have been the first character to emerge that was different than what seemed the norm, but one might dismiss her forwardness a little bit since she was, after all, a Yankee. But entering popular culture in a huge way. With the publication of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind in 1936, a new wave of romanticism about the Civil War began. In Tony Horwitz's bestseller, Confederates in the Attic, Dispatches from an Unfinished Civil War, Horwitz goes on a series of adventures through the southern United States to find out, in part, just what continued to fascinate us about the war. He encounters some tourist traps outside of Atlanta where people are selling maps to places in the book that don't actually exist. Gone with the Wind, he wrote, had more to keep the Civil War alive, to mold its memory, than any book or event since Appomattox. Why dig for the real and unremembered past when I could search like Japanese tourists had earlier that day for the fictional one instead? Some places even went so far as to hire actresses to portray Scarlett O'Hara at everything from store openings to car shows to business conventions. In fact, one young lady goes to Japan on a regular basis and plays Scarlett O'Hara for the Empress of Japan. They love her over there. It's crazy. It's a very, very fun book. So we have this type, the Scarlet type. Child of the plantations, outrageous flirt, prone to showing her shoulders in mixed company before 3 o'clock, things that were not regularly done. And if they were certainly not written about very often. But there were some Southern women who captivated whole crowds of suitors with their beauty, of course. But the idea of romantic love is just emerging. Scarlett can flatter herself all she likes, but most of the men in this picture historically would be looking at her position as the eldest heir at Tara, rather than those beautiful creamy shoulders. The First Lady of the Confederacy, by contrast, was a beauty, to be sure. And unlike Scarlett, who was the daughter of an Irish immigrant, Verena Howell Davis was a blue blood from 2 very old American families. In fact, this is one of 2 things that kept her parents from being happy about her marriage to a Democratic self-made Jefferson Davis. She herself commented to Davis's brother Joe that it seemed odd that they should ally themselves with what she called the party of the commoner, as the Democratic Party was then known to Whigs like her family, the Howells. The other objection was that he was a widower. I don't know if you know the story of Jefferson Davis and Knox Taylor, but it's the stuff of the best romance novels. I'm really shocked Hollywood has not made a movie about it. But they say that Jefferson pined for his first wife the rest of his life. And Verena herself was very intelligent, graceful, and what we know about her comes from her life as a public figure that really began with her husband's election in 1861 and continued through the war. Her public defense and fight to secure his freedom afterwards, her ambitious memoirs, written in part to try and vindicate him and his character, and a brief but liberating career right towards the end of her life as a journalist in New York. Just as gritty as Scarlett, Verena endured the hardships of the war and want, reconstruction, loss, and much of it with less than supportive or loving spouse. She may not have drawn her strength from the red earth of Terra, but no one could deny that this woman possessed great strength and true grit. Another character I like to call Melanie. She's another archetype of Civil War woman, somewhat vacuous, ever devoted, think the best of everyone, sort who is lost in the changing world of women's roles that comes with the war. Melanie is described by her husband as the quintessential chatelaine of 12 oaks, a gentle hand that binds the whole of the Old South together with its delicacy. I always think of Carol Burnett's famous sketch, The Wind Done Gone. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Where she comes down with the curtain rod slung over her shoulder and says, I saw it in the window and I had to have it. I love that. Well, I always think of that because her Scarlet character is always just taking Melanie by the hair and she's pushing her in the punch bowl. And I always want to Melanie, stand up for yourself. She's trying to steal your husband. But she is perhaps, ironically, the closest to Jefferson Davis's ideal woman, whose altar is hearth and home. The irony, then, is perhaps that the most quintessential real Melanie in the Civil War is the wife of Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Julia grew up in the South, in a slave-holding family in Missouri. South being a relative term, the South of the culture, maybe not location. And completely doted on by her father, and at times a bit like Scarlett in that she talked of many male acquaintances who would visit her, including James Longstreet, her future husband's best friend, who, as you know, surrenders to her husband with Lee at Appomattox. Awkward family reunions all around. Carol Birkin describes Julia in a lecture, in a rather unflattering way, as Dent the Ditz. She's an easy person for a 21st century woman to be frustrated with. Here she was, sitting calmly in the center of the maelstrom of history as a model of domesticity, and what Birkin describes as a reminder of the rewards of an unexamined life. She didn't know a whole lot about politics, about world affairs, about really what the war was even about, and she didn't care. And it's hard for female historians sometimes to wrap their head around. Grant himself was a very shy man, and he hated the glittering social scene. Many have speculated that he liked Julia so much because she didn't challenge him in that regard. He didn't challenge her, and she didn't challenge him in their assigned societal domestic roles. In fact, during her time with Grant during the Vicksburg campaigns, she was arguing with some Confederate women who were saying that the actions of Lincoln's government were unconstitutional. And Julia exclaimed, "Well, I do not know a thing about this dreadful Constitution, and I told them so. They seemed such astonished and asked, 'Well, surely you have studied it.' 'No, I have not,' she replied. 'I would not know where to look for it, even if I wished to read it.'" And yes, this is a woman who eventually becomes the First Lady of the United States. And for me, who has lived with presidents like, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who became a senator, and Barbara Bush and Laura Bush, who were just these incredible, intelligent women. I was taken aback when I read this. And Julia preferred to face all the big questions of the day only in terms of how they affected her loved ones. And in a way, she represents a huge portion of women in the Civil War in doing so. Grant always seemed to be bemused by his wife's confusion, but he never wished to change her. Theirs was a very happy marriage. They were devoted to one another right to the end. So, who myths? How many of you are familiar with the series North and South? Remember that? The 1980s? All right. In the years since Gone with the Wind, there have been countless novels, films, and television series that have provided us with characters that may or may not reflect reality. One of my favorites is this series that first aired in 1986. It's laced with real history based on John Jake's best-selling trilogy. They gave us a new batch of female stereotypes with edginess, more plunging necklines, and bangs. Oh, the bangs. I searched high and low through Civil War photos and portraits for a single set of prominent hair bangs, and I found nothing. Women seem parted severely down the middle, and that's that. So pretty much every hairdo in this miniseries is wrong, which I love. I love that. I love to play what's wrong with this picture with my students. One of the more interesting characters is the woman who's in this picture, Virgilia Hazard, who's played by Christy Alley. She's a Pennsylvania girl, right in the heart of the abolitionist movement, and not a fan at all of her older brother's best friend, who's from South Carolina. And here you see her giving a speech alongside such greats as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. And she looks fantastic to a modern audience, but completely out of place with most of her contemporaries in the reform movement, many of whom are Quakers. Her alarming speech delved into topics that no woman of a decent family would discuss in so public a forum. So why would the producers take this kind of a risk with this character? Well, the answer lies, believe it or not, in the truth. The real women of the abolitionist movements themselves were plenty shocking. Lucy Stone, who's on the left, and Sarah and Angelina Grimke were not at all the norm. Angelina and Sarah were daughters of a plantation owner in South Carolina who ran away from their families and told them that they could not continue to hold such opinions as freedom for slaves and an equal position in society for women. And yet, Angelina in particular was keenly aware of her place in the world, including vocally objecting to slave revolts or insurrections as a solution to the problem. Violence was not the answer. She gave voice to the question of her female readers of her compelling arguments. She wrote this appeal to women about getting women involved in the abolition movement. She writes, "Why appeal to women on this subject?" she wrote. "We do not make laws which perpetuate slavery. No legislative power is invested in us. We can do nothing to overthrow the system, even if we wish to do so." But Angelina's answer was simple. Women could not and must not hide behind claims of helplessness, for they are the wives, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters of those who do. Their power lay in the intimate relationships and in the moral influence women held over men. It's fitting that after a brief and spectacular time on the circuit, lecturing and writing pamphlets, Angelina met and married her fellow abolitionist Theodore Well, and in doing so, all but disappeared from the public eye in favor of the Sacred Heart at home. Which I think is a very interesting. She had this very, very public life, and then as soon as she got married, I'm not. And that was very, very typical of women who had these brief careers. They didn't keep going, most of them. I'm sure there's an exception to all mine at some point. So where does this leave us? That's me. You might recognize some of those rain-drenched soldiers from the event you guys did. Where does this leave us as we struggle to educate people on the past? As a teacher, this is something that interests me greatly. Believe it or not, it's not a bad place having all these myths. As much as these myths and the influx of popular culture, if you think about, more recently we had Robert Hicks and the Widow of the South, or Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain. As much as these sometimes perpetuate the stereotypes, they also pique our interest. We're going to be looking for the real history as long as we're interested in the war itself. And the fact that you can't get a hotel room, a campsite, or a parking space within 100 miles of Gettysburg this summer, between, say, June 29th and July 7th, is any indication interest in the Civil War is not going away. Things like Little Women, Gone with the Wind, North and South, these are what led me to the real thing. What started as a whimsical Halloween costume at the age of 14 has grown into a genuine interest in the letters and diaries and memoirs of these women. And these are the things I share with my students. The myths themselves are so useful to me as a teacher. We love to play what's wrong with this picture in my classes and pick them apart. It's up to us then as historians to educate, using, if we must, these myths as a starting point. We owe these real women much. I wonder often what they would think of me, a 38-year-old history teacher who often knows more about things what happened 150 years ago than she remembers about her own schedule for the day. and who, for fun and learning, pretend sometimes to be them. I often wonder, what would they make of me? Thank you. Oh, yeah. Any questions? Any questions? Honestly, I'm very used to questions. Did I talk too long?
No.
Sure?
No.
Okay. That was really me in the picture. It's a Ford poster. I got on a bus in it. That was pretty epic. I tried to convince my students that they too could get on a bus and boost it. We'll see if anyone are brave enough to try it tomorrow morning.
We drive a car.
We do. We do. I haven't been able to drive in mine though, because it's just wide enough that I can't. My car has a stick shift and I can't.
It's just underneath the skirt.
That works.
Pretty easier than that.
Yeah, in a van is much easier. So, yeah, if you have any questions afterwards or you want to email me, you know how to get hold of me. And, I love to talk about this stuff. I love to lend out the contents of my library, so I'm happy to share it with you. Thank you very much for joining me.